The wind howled through the trees, sending shivers through the dense forest as the car pulled up to the house. The tires crunched on the gravel driveway, the sound unnaturally loud in the stillness of the night. For a moment, no one spoke. The headlights flickered before going out, leaving the group bathed in the pale light of a waxing moon. A figure stood motionless on the porch, silhouetted against the decrepit wooden walls of the house. No one had been there just moments before. "Did you see that?" whispered Sarah, her voice barely audible. Jake glanced over, his knuckles white as he gripped the steering wheel. "See what?" His voice was steady, but the sharp intake of breath gave away his unease. Sarah blinked, her eyes fixed on the spot where she had seen the figure. There was someone standing there. "Stop messing around, Sarah. This place is creepy enough," grumbled Mark from the back seat, shaking his head. The house loomed ahead, its darkened windows like hollow eyes, staring back at them, waiting. As they stepped out of the car, the cold air bit into their skin, making the hair on their arms stand on end. The house had been abandoned for decades, or so the locals said. Yet, here it stood, as if waiting for its next victims. Jake was the first to approach, his boots crunching on the overgrown grass as he made his way up the stone steps. The wood beneath his feet groaned in protest as he pushed open the heavy front door. Inside, a stench of rot and mildew hit them all at once. It was as if the house had been holding its breath, waiting for someone to disturb its long-held secrets. The walls were covered in dark stains, and cobwebs hung like veils in the corners. The air felt heavy, oppressive, pressing down on them with each step. "It smells like something died in here," said Linda, wrinkling her nose. "Probably just animals," Jake muttered, though he didn't sound convinced. A loud bang echoed from somewhere upstairs, causing everyone to freeze in place. "What was that?" Mark whispered, eyes wide. Jake swallowed hard. "Just the wind." But deep down, they all knew it wasn't the wind. The group fanned out through the house, the wooden floors creaking under their feet. Sarah felt uneasy, as if they were being watched. Every step seemed to echo too loudly, each shadow flickering with the promise of something more. She couldn't shake the feeling that they shouldn't be there. As they ventured further, Sarah spotted something in the corner of the room, a faded photograph in a broken frame. She knelt down to get a closer look. The image was of a family, a man, woman, and 2 children, standing in front of the very house they now stood in. The faces were blurred, but the man's eyes seemed to stare directly at her, even through the years. An icy chill ran down her spine as she picked up the frame. Scratched into the wood beneath the photo were 2 words: "Get out." The sun dipped below the horizon, casting the house in a thick blanket of darkness. Mark had found some old candles in the kitchen, and the flickering flames did little to ease the growing tension. "Why did we come here again?" Linda asked, her voice trembling. "Because it's just a house," Jake replied, though he sounded less sure than before. "There's no such thing as ghosts." But as the night wore on, strange things began to happen. Footsteps echoed through the halls, though no one was walking. Doors slammed shut without warning, and cold drafts swept through the rooms despite the windows being boarded up. It was Mark who saw it first, a shadowy figure moving at the edge of his vision, just outside the living room window. His heart raced, his breath caught in his throat as he backed away. "Did anyone else see that?" he whispered. The others shook their heads, but the tension in the room grew palpable. Sarah couldn't sleep. Every creak of the house sent her heart racing. She had tried convincing herself that it was just her imagination, but she knew better. Something wasn't right here. She lay awake, staring up at the ceiling when she heard it, a soft whisper, faint but unmistakable. "Sarah!" Her blood ran cold. She bolted upright, her eyes scanning the room. There was no one there, yet the voice had been so close, as if someone had been right next to her. "Jake! Linda!" she called out, her voice trembling. But there was no response. Suddenly, the door creaked open on its own. Sarah's heart pounded as she stepped toward it, each step slower than the last. When she reached the hallway, she saw it, an outline of a figure at the end of the corridor, standing motionless, watching her. Her breath caught in her throat. She couldn't scream. She couldn't move. The figure stepped forward, and with each step, the temperature in the hallway dropped further until she could see her breath in the air. And then, just as suddenly, it was gone. The next morning, they decided to search the house for any clues that might explain what was happening. In the dusty attic, they found an old chest, locked with a rusted iron latch. It took all of Jake's strength to break it open. Inside were old newspaper clippings, journals, and photographs, evidence of the house's dark past. The house had once belonged to a man named Henry Calloway, a recluse who had lived there with his family decades ago. But one night, the entire family had disappeared. Some said Henry had gone mad and killed them all. Others believed the house itself was cursed, driving those who lived there to madness. One of the journal entries caught Sarah's attention. "The house. It speaks to me. It wants us to stay, to become part of it. There is no escaping it. No matter how hard I try, it pulls me back." The group exchanged uneasy glances. It was clear now. They weren't just dealing with an ordinary haunting. The house was alive, and it wanted them. As the days passed, the atmosphere in the house grew heavier, darker. Jake had started hearing voices, soft whispers calling his name in the dead of night. Linda was seeing things, shadows moving in the corners of her vision. And Mark had become increasingly paranoid, convinced that the house was watching them, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Sarah, however, was the worst off. She had begun to see visions, horrible, twisted visions of the past. She saw Henry Calloway, his eyes wild with madness, pacing the halls of the house. She saw his family, trapped, screaming, trying to escape but never able to. She realized with a sickening certainty that the same fate awaited them. The house wasn't just haunted, it was a prison, and once you entered, it would never let you leave. The night was colder than ever, the air thick with the weight of unseen eyes. The group huddled together in the living room, their nerves frayed, their minds racing. They needed to leave, but every time they tried to step outside, the house seemed to twist and change, its corridors stretching into infinity, its doors leading nowhere. They were trapped. "We need to destroy it," Jake said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Burn it down." "But what if we're still inside?" Linda asked, her eyes wide with fear. Jake didn't answer. Deep down, they all knew the truth. The house wouldn't let them leave. Not alive, anyway. The fire spread quickly, the flames licking at the walls, hungry for destruction. The group huddled together, watching as the house began to burn. But instead of being consumed, the fire seemed to feed it, growing brighter, hotter, as if the house were alive, reveling in the chaos. Suddenly, the walls began to shake, and a deafening roar filled the air. The ground beneath them split open, revealing a chasm of darkness, from which emerged twisted, grotesque figures, shadows from the past, souls trapped in the house for eternity. The house was not just haunted, it was a doorway to hell. As the flames roared around them, Jake grabbed Sarah's hand, pulling her toward the front door. The ground shook beneath their feet, the house groaning as if in pain, but they pushed forward. Behind them, the shadows writhed and twisted, clawing at the walls, their screams filling the air. With one final push, they burst through the front door, falling onto the cold, hard ground outside. The house roared behind them, but they didn't stop running. They didn't look back. They ran until they could no longer hear the screams. The house burned to the ground that night, leaving nothing but ashes and memories behind. Jake, Sarah, and Linda stood in silence, watching as the flames consumed the last remnants of the place that had nearly destroyed them. But even as the fire died down, they couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't truly over. The house may have been gone, but its presence,